Welcome to the Ljubljana podcast, the place to come for travel and food tips, cultural highlights, insider stories, and chats with locals. It's everything you need to know about Slovenia's beloved capital city. I'm your host, Slovenia's ambassador of tourism, Noah Charney. Let's fire it up. This is a special episode of the Ljubljana podcast, all about Jože Plečnik. So we're going to go to some specific locations in Ljubljana related to Plečnik's life and work. I've designed this not as a chronological tour, and it's not in great depth about Plečnik, but this is really designed for people interested in the person I've called Slovenia's greatest ever artist, and trying to get an introductory walking, self-guided tour that will whet the appetite. And of course, if you're interested in learning more, you can go to some of Ljubljana's wonderful museums or do one of the official Plečnik guided tours run by Visit Ljubljana for much more depth. I'm going to suggest that we start at the Hotel Mrak, not only because they are one of the sponsors of this podcast, but because they are right next to a number of works by Plečnik. And before we get started, I'm going to let you go to Hotel Mrak, which is right near the Krizanke complex, which is the home of the Ljubljana Festival, one of Europe's oldest and most prestigious classical music festivals, and the corner of Vega Street, Vegova ulica, which is another piece of urban design made by Jože Plečnik. While you're going there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Plečnik's background, and then we will look at a handful of his buildings and urban designs. These will include Krizanke, a monument to Napoleon, NUK, or the National and University Library. We'll look also at Vega Street, Park Zvezda, or Star Park, and we'll continue on to the Triple Bridge, which is his design. We'll look at the Cobbler's Bridge on the way, then go to Tržnice, or the Central Market Square, with a couple of other places we can look at along the way from a bit of a distance. So this should be about a 1-hour guided walking tour. Jože Plečnik was born in 1872, at a time when Slovenia was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Slovenia had been part of the Habsburg and then Austro-Hungarian Empire since the 16th century, and it always existed within the context of a larger empire. There was a period, as we'll see shortly, when it was part of the Napoleonic Empire, when Napoleon made this part of the world something that he called the Illyrian provinces. And one of the things that he did was make Slovenian the official language for a brief period of time, whereas the official language throughout most of Slovenia's history was German. That was the language of the ruling class, of administration and business. Slovenian was what you would speak at home. German was what you would speak at work and in school. The very quiet revolution that Slovenia underwent, not a bloody one, but more a cultural one, was based on speaking Slovenian within the context of the German-speaking empire. But we'll save details about that for a separate episode. Plečnik grew up in Ljubljana, and he immediately had great talent as a draftsman. He was really good at drawing. And he had such talent that he aimed to go and study in Vienna. 4 people from what was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Slovenia, the place to go and study if you were particularly talented and you had a great deal of drive was Vienna. And that is where most of the most prominent Slovenians went to study if they had a career that would begin with a university degree, which of course was not requisite at the time. But Plečnik was interested in going to a special school in Vienna called the Wagnerschule, which was the architecture academy run by a man named Otto Wagner. He sent in some drawings and his application, and it was clear to Wagner that this was a very talented young man, but he didn't have enough of the background to start as a university student. So instead, he began to do some work in Austria in preparation for starting at the Wagnerschule. And he spent a little more than a year doing work as a draftsman in a cabinetry shop. And he was studying in the meantime to make sure that he had enough of a background to start at what was then really the most prestigious architectural academy in Europe. Otto Wagner was a big fan of Jože Plečnik. He was someone who was hugely influential in terms of teaching the next generation of great architects. And the architectural style that was predominant at that time in Austria was called Secessionism. Secessionism is essentially the Austrian equivalent of Art Deco or Art Nouveau. Those are terms that might bring to mind architectural images more quickly than Secessionism. But that was what was the avant-garde at the time. Wagner's own architecture was not secessionist. He had more of a classical bent to it, but that was what was exciting at the time in Vienna. Plečnik showed a huge amount of talent, but was also interested in theory. And there's one theoretician whose name we should know. We're talking about Plečnik, and that is Gottfried Semper. Gottfried Semper was probably the most influential art historian and theorist in the German-speaking world at the time. And Plečnik's interpretation of Semper's ideas, which we'll talk about in just a moment when we go into Krizanke, was important in the direction that his art would take and also where he would differ from the ideas of Otto Wagner. So Plečnik is this young, dynamic Slavic student coming to a Teutonic capital, and it would cause him some problems because there was an anti-Slavic sentiment in Vienna. But Plečnik really showed his abilities. He was the favorite student of Otto Wagner, and he won the top prize for his dissertation, his thesis, at Wagner's academy. And Wagner groomed him to take over for him after he retired. He was that much of a talent. And Wagner 3 times nominated Plečnik to take over for him in charge of the Wagnerschule. And 3 times the Archduke turned him down, probably because he didn't think that a Slav should have this position as the highest architecture professor in the empire, when the empire was a Teutonic one. So Plečnik did some projects in Vienna early on in his career, but the writing was on the wall. He understood that he would only be able to rise so far as a Slav in this Teutonic capital. And then he got an invitation from one of his friends who was teaching in Prague. So he moved to Prague. Czechoslovakia at that point was run by the new democratic president Tomáš Masaryk. And Prague for Slavs was considered the most advanced culturally. It was the place to be with the most exciting things happening. So for someone from Slovenia going to Prague, this was the equivalent of, making it big. This is the equivalent of artists traveling to Rome in the 15th century or to Paris in the 19th century. This is where the action was. In Prague, Plečnik became the favorite of Tomáš Masaryk, and his highest profile work of his career, really, in terms of the most people seeing it, was the conversion of Prague Castle. If you've ever been to Prague, I'm sure you've seen it, from a feudal fortress into a fortress for this new democracy of Czechoslovakia. And that conversion, that renovation was done by Plečnik on behalf of Tomáš Masaryk. Tomáš Masaryk's daughter, Alice, also had a big crush on Plečnik. There's a funny story where she was so enamored of him that when he kissed her on the cheek, she fainted. And Plečnik, unfortunately for her, was never interested in the ladies. He had a number of girlfriends, but he was never interested in getting married. He said he was married to architecture. But so he worked in Prague and for Tomáš Masaryk for a number of years. But then in 1919, University of Ljubljana opened. And he had a chance to finally return to his homeland of Ljubljana. But here's the thing, Ljubljana was not considered a desirable place to be then. It's only relatively recently that Ljubljana became a proper city and the very advanced, stylish, desirable capital it is today. Plečnik himself called Ljubljana a cultural backwater when he was growing up in it. And part of his mission was to turn Ljubljana into a place that would be desirable to live. He tried to conceive of it as a new Athens. And he was into classicism, so of course Athens was the best place that you could try to emulate. And he actually got pretty far. As we'll see, he managed to get all of the commissions for public spaces that would be built in a Greek polis or ancient Greek city. And he couldn't have planned that. It had to happen because of opportunities. But he got those opportunities. Why? In 1895, there was an earthquake that devastated Ljubljana. Around 15% of the center was leveled by this earthquake. And Plečnik was a young man at the time. But by the time Ljubljana got back on its feet and was commissioning new reconstructions to deal with the damage, was several decades on, and Plečnik was at the time by far the best architect in Slovenia. If you ask me, he's the single greatest artist from Slovenia in any media through history. And he was in the right place at the right time. So he managed to get most of these high-profile commissions. That's why when you walk around Ljubljana, it has a feel that it's Plečnik's city, much more than other cities that we associate with other architects. We think of Barcelona as the city of Antoni Gaudi, for example. But Gaudi only has a handful of structures and a park in Barcelona, whereas Plečnik's imprint can be felt throughout the city of Ljubljana, both in urban design, urban spaces like parks, embankments, bridges, and lots of buildings too. So it really is his city. He is the genius loci of Ljubljana. So in 1919, University of Ljubljana opened, and all of a sudden, there was a position for him to work as a professor of architecture there. At the same time, his brother Andrei, who was a priest, bought a house that was big enough that Plečnik and his brother and other family members could live there. It was a place that he could call home in his hometown, that he could make his own because he would renovate his own house, the one that his brother Andrei bought as a family seat in Ljubljana. He could make it his own, and he had a position as professor of architecture. And then, of course, he had the city to rebuild. So when I wrote my PhD dissertation on Jože Plečnik, and you can still find some copies, it was published as a limited edition book by the City Museums of Ljubljana. And if you go to the City Museum bookshop, which is right next to Krizanke and Hotel Mrak, you can still get a copy. It's a very beautifully designed book, which I had nothing to do with, but hopefully the text is okay as well. My PhD was on Plečnik, and it was called Eternal Architect, The Descent and Rise of Jože Plečnik. And Plečnik's decision not to join any major architectural movements like Siam, which was run by Le Corbusier, which was the main modernist movement during his career. Instead, he focused on coming home and rebuilding Ljubljana and working primarily in Slovenia. It was somewhat of a self-sacrifice because he probably would have been much more of a household name if he had gone to New York or London or Paris and worked in a higher profile environment. But he went home to rebuild his broken hometown, and Ljubljana can be very grateful for it. So that's the short introduction to Plečnik, and now let's look at some of his buildings. Our first stop is Krizanke Summer Theatre. This you'll approach from Hotel Mrak, if that's where you started. You'll cross a little roundabout, and you can see that it's a walled enclosure. That walled enclosure once housed a medieval monastery of a German order of monastic knights. And you can still visit a Baroque church if you can catch it when it's open. I've lived here many years and only been inside a few times, but it's a beautiful space if you can ask someone when it's going to be open to the public. But we're going to go through a walkway that is under the arch that pierces the outside wall of the monastery. You can see that it's the main entrance to what has become a summer theater. In the 1950s, Plečnik was commissioned to develop this, at that point, rundown monastery into an outdoor theater space that would house the new Ljubljana Festival, which is one of Ljubljana's cultural highlights. It's been a standard presence in the summertime for many decades, and it's a music festival primarily of classical music of international renown. So this was going to be its home base. When you walk through that archway, you can see some elements that were already in situ. So some older looking statues. There's one of the Virgin Mary, for example, inside an archway as you walk into the left. And then on the right, you can actually see a bust of Jože Plečnik. He's got this wonderful beard that looks sort of like an Assyrian king, and a very angular buzz cut in this bust, at least. Plečnik was someone who was interested in being commemorated the way he wanted to be seen. He didn't particularly like to have his picture taken, or so he said, but he was very photogenic, and there are a lot of pictures of him looking very serious, looking sort of like this ancient king or Tibetan monk. He had a very conspicuous long white beard, and he would regularly wear a tall black hat as he could be seen walking around Ljubljana. This bust of him is nice because it overlooks Krizanke, which is one of his later significant works, but it's a good place to start on our walking tour. So the idea was to take this monastery and repurpose it into a summer theater. And depending on the accessibility of the time when you visit, you may be able to see the theater space, which is on the far side through a set of glass white wooden doors. And there you have a sort of step system that is reminiscent, or at least it's intended to be, of ancient Greek amphitheaters. But ancient Greek amphitheaters were in a semicircle around a stage, and they had very steep seating, and people would sit on these steps themselves. Here, there are longer, gentler steps with chairs set up so that everyone can see well. There's not a bad seat in the house. It's really recommended, if you can, to catch a concert here. Plečnik was also aware of the haves and have-nots, that not everyone would be able to afford tickets to a concert. And so he intentionally made it so that if you couldn't afford a ticket, you could sit in one of the benches around the park on the outside edge of the low wall that surrounds the Krizanke complex, and you could listen to the concert and hear it perfectly well for free. Of course, if you get a ticket, you get to see it and you have much more of a better view, let's say. You have to just imagine what the performers look like if you sit outside. But he had this idea that there's a democratic approach to this. If people are bringing concerts to Ljubljana, then people who, even those who can't afford to have tickets, should be able to enjoy it. One of the things that's also noticeable if you are in this main atrium area is to look up at some very Plečnik elements to it. So see if you can find a vase that is in a niche inside a facade that serves no purpose, really. It's just decorative. There are also elements of columns or their square equivalent pilasters, which you can find at various places around Plečnik buildings. It's a little bit of a Where's Waldo treasure hunt. And these are classic Plečnik elements. He loved columns, he loved pilasters, he loved vases. He liked to include essentially Etruscan or Italianate elements to architecture in a part of the world that didn't usually have them. So Ljubljana was originally founded as a Roman city called Emona that developed out of a military barracks, as most Roman cities did. But it doesn't have a Mediterranean feel to it. It was made wholesale from scratch by this Roman encampment, so it's not more ancient than something that's Roman. So Etruscans are a civilization that predated the Romans. And in Italy, there's a sort of funny habit where Italian city-states in the Renaissance period used to compete with each other to see who was the oldest, because being an older settlement or part of an older civilization was considered cooler, let's say. And you even have instances where a city like Viterbo, which is in Lazio outside of Rome, there was an instance where a bishop actually forged antiquities, buried them, and quote-unquote discovered them to prove that Viterbo had ancient Egyptian origins, which is far older than the Etruscan origins of so many central Italian cities. So this idea that the older your civilization is, the cooler it is something that is inherent to Italians. And when Plečnik won the Rome Prize for having had the best dissertation project at Wagner's school in Vienna, he got to spend 2 years traveling through Italy, exploring architectural wonders. And that's where he fell in love with the architectural traditions of Italy. He came back to Ljubljana and he saw that Slovenia and Ljubljana didn't have much of an architectural tradition themselves, and he thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if they did? And there was a theory bouncing around called the Venetian theory, and this was unproven archaeologically, but Plečnik quite liked the idea that Slovenia was once part of the Etruscan landscape of the Mediterranean. And while this wasn't true according to the archaeological record, Plečnik tried to make it true by introducing elements of architecture that were associated with traditional Etruscan buildings and other Mediterranean elements that would give Ljubljana a sort of vibe of Mediterranean tradition. And this sounds maybe a little bit weird, but if you look to the US, for example, the earliest architecture in America in the 18th century was designed not by professional architects, but by farmers and politicians and mathematicians who dabbled in architecture. And they imported architectural elements from ancient Athens in particular, because they were founding a new democracy, and ancient Athens is the most famous democracy of them all. So with this tradition in mind, Plečnik was trying to effectively give Ljubljana a longer historical root system of being a place of architectural and cultural interest than it actually had. And so we can see that in his architecture in these columns that look classical, in incorporating vases into architecture, which was never really done, but we have this association that vases are part of the classical world. And Plečnik tried to conceive of Ljubljana, his renovated version of Ljubljana, which he had the opportunity to do thanks to being the most capable architect during a period after 1895, when there was this devastating earthquake that knocked down 15% of Ljubljana city center. And he was the one charged with renovating and building up the city again and trying to make it more of a cultural center than it ever was before. We can also see that here at Krizanke, if you look at some of the facades on the inside of the courtyard, there's the use of sgraffito, which is a fancy word that means essentially carved ornamentation that decorates the facades. And you can see that there are different shapes. There's some dolphin-like shapes that you might be familiar with if you've traveled through Italy. It has a vibe of the Italianate grotesques. Grotesque is a word that actually comes from the Italian word grotto, which means a cave. And it refers to images seen on the walls of ancient Roman ruins that had been buried over the centuries of life in Rome, which is sort of a layer cake of buildings being built on top of buildings with recycled elements. And in the Renaissance, there were artists, and we might even say urban explorers, who would dig around and effectively break through the roof of ancient Roman buildings, which were at street level or just below it during the Renaissance, because Rome was built many layers on top of each other. And they would go down into these man-made urban caves that were actually rooms of houses, and they would go down by lamplight, and they would see these spooky or magical or grotesque, we would say today, creatures painted on the walls. And this was a part of ancient Roman wall decoration, but it was something that was new to people in the Renaissance who were seeing it for the first time because so much of it was buried. And they referred to these as grotesques because they were visited by visiting these grottos or caves, which were actually old Roman houses. Digressing a little bit, but Plečnik would not copy-paste images that he saw elsewhere, things that he saw during his travels in Italy when he had won the Rome Prize. He would absorb what he saw and make it his own, and he would move forward, creating something that had the vibe, the German word for this is Stimmung, that's the word he would have used, of a past period or an architectural style. But it wouldn't be copy-paste, it would be internalizing it and making it his own, which makes him one of the greats. To understand Plečnik's approach to architecture, there's a little bit of theory we need, and I know nobody likes theories, and you probably were rolling your eyes as I said the word, but it's going to be useful for our walking tour. So the main theoretical framework that informed Plečnik was written by Gottfried Semper, S-E-M-P-E-R. Gottfried Semper was probably the most prominent artistic and architectural historical theorist of 19th century Germany. And his most important book was called The Four Elements of Architecture. It came out in 1851. And this was the go-to text that anybody studying architecture or art history in the German-speaking world would have been familiar with, particularly at Plečnik's time. We're talking about the 1890s, circa 1900, which is when he was in his formative period. So Semper's got this idea that architecture evolved from four basic elements: hearth, roof, enclosure, and mound. And he's talking about the idea that human needs have not changed from prehistoric times to the present day. We needed a hearth to make a fire. We needed roof to keep the rain and inclement weather out. We needed an enclosure that's effectively protecting us from the elements or from animals or from neighbors. And we needed a mound. This is the sort of the living area. And things have developed technologically, but the basic elements remain consistent. He's talking about in houses. That was one element that, every building, every house in this case needs those attributes, and that human needs have not changed, only the materials with which we make those needs become plastic, become realized, have changed. He also talked about how important ornamentation was, that it's not just decorative, but it's an integral part of architecture, and it helps tell the story that the building is trying to tell. So it's the opposite of modernist minimalism, which is why Plečnik, who's working and living in the modernist period, is not at all a minimalist and doesn't really look modernist from an aesthetic perspective. The aspect of modernism that people sometimes forget about was the philosophical one, the idea that good architecture living in a well-designed building can actually have a social benefit. It can elevate the lifestyle or the feeling of self-worth, the quality of life of people who interact with or live in that architecture. So it's not just about making a cool building, and it's not just about making a cool building for someone very wealthy, but there's a social project to good architecture, and that everyone should live in good spaces that are well thought out, and your quality of life will be better for it. So that aspect of modernism Plečnik was into. The minimalism, not so much. Plečnik interpreted Semper's ideas of architecture as a synthesis of structural function and symbolic meaning. So the structure has to work, of course, but the shapes that he uses, and especially the decorative elements that don't have a purpose in keeping the building up, it's not structurally necessary, but it's decorative, should have a symbolic meaning and convey part of the story. Ornament was an essential part of the storytelling aspect of architecture, and it was conveying things like cultural identity and history, and in his case, spirituality, because he was a very enthusiastic Catholic and was interested in Catholic mysticism. So this is the long way of saying that the elements you see that appear decorative on a building by Plečnik were designed by him and are part of the overall story he wants to tell. And much of the story he wants to tell is trying to give Ljubljana the illusion of being more ancient and more important culturally than it actually was. Now, there's one other space in Krizanke that I would mention that you can rarely see, so it's a bit of a tease to say it, but there's a space called the Devil's Courtyard. And if you go in there, and it's used often as a green room for performers these days, but if you can maybe call up and ask if there's a chance to see it, especially at night, it's got these sort of metal hooded lamps recessed into the walls. And at night, when you turn the lights on and it's dark out, it looks like a sort of night sky, a starscape that you're standing in. It's a really beautiful space. So that would be the one, level up tour element if you think you can do it, and call ahead and try to find someone who would give you a tour of that or let you in. That would be a cool thing to do. Now we're going to step outside of Krizanke and move on to the next building. I'm often asked where I recommend staying in Ljubljana. My answer is easy: Hotel Mrak. Hotel Mrak is my home away from home in Slovenia's capital. It's a family-run, elegant boutique hotel with a perfect location, right in the pedestrian-friendly heart of the city. You can easily walk anywhere from Hotel Mrak. Like me, it's got an artsy vibe, and it also has an epically good breakfast that is worth a journey. Take a look for yourself at hotelmrak.si. That's hotelmrak.si. Just outside of the Krizanke monument, you will see a monument to Napoleon. It looks like a big white obelisk with a bust of Napoleon that's gilded. This was designed in 1929, and it might give you pause because, aside from France and Corsica, the whole world thinks Napoleon was bad news. He's a very unpopular figure historically because he was, taking over most of Europe. So why is he popular in Ljubljana enough to have a monument named after him? So Napoleon is popular here because there was a brief period during which Slovenia was part of his empire when this territory was seized by him from Austria-Hungary. And he established what were called the Illyrian provinces from 1809 to 1813. And during that time, Ljubljana was a capital, so it was more important than it ever had been. And more importantly for Slovenes, Slovenian was the official language. You have to keep in mind that Slovenia functioned at a quite comfortable and unoppressed level within the context of empires for almost all of its existence. Now, for most of the time, from 1500 until the First World War, it was the Habsburgs, which morphed into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the official language was German during that time. The Habsburg monarchy was actually quite progressive. They didn't really mind what your religion was, provided you weren't behaving in revolutionary ways. And they understood that they were a multi-ethnic empire, but they were determined that everyone should speak German, and the German language was going to be the thread that knit everyone in the empire together. So if you were going to school, if you're going to work, if you were engaged in politics, German would have been the language, and you might speak Slovene at home, but you weren't supposed to do it in any public way. German was the default. And so during this period, 1809 to 1813, suddenly Slovenian was the official language. The government was run in Slovenian. School could be taught in Slovenian. And this, for Slovenes, was a really big deal because Slovenes had always held their identity close to their language. They were never involved in military revolutions. Aside from a few peasant uprisings here and there, they were aware that this would be futile. There weren't enough of them. They weren't strong enough. So they put their heads down. They were humble and hardworking. They didn't make trouble. They were a dream come true for emperors everywhere because they basically did what they were told. They did it well, and they didn't make trouble. Now, that might sound like a negative, but it was a really smart tactic historically because this part of the world has essentially not suffered. Of course, there's no historical period or part of the world that hasn't suffered at all. But if you look at the turmoil and issues that so much of the world has had, Slovenes and Slovenia has really gotten away with as little turmoil and suffering as possible throughout their history. And that's not just down to luck. That is down to them basically being smart about what they were capable of and not. But they focused on keeping their culture alive, their sense of unity and identity through their language. So it was great that Napoleon set up this brief period of time when Slovenians were effectively running their own area in their own language. And that's why he is beloved in this part of the world for that brief period of the Illyrian provinces. If you look to Vega Street, which starts with Krizanke and the monument to Napoleon, this is a street also designed by Plečnik through the 1920s, and it's meant to be sort of the high culture street. It's lined with monuments, busts of famous Slovenians, scientists and creatives. And Plečnik worked with some of his favorite regular collaborator sculptors. He also had mosaicists and painters who were his preferred collaborators when he did projects like this. You can see their consistent work alongside Plečnik's own, especially throughout the Ljubljana area. And what's nice is he was involved in all aspects of the design. So it really is a complete work of art by Plečnik. We have the association in America with Frank Lloyd Wright designing every aspect of every building that he designed, whereas architects usually just dealt with the building itself, but not, for example, lighting fixtures or chairs or door handles. But Plečnik, like Frank Lloyd Wright, wanted to design every aspect of everything he did, and he did so at an extremely high level and with attention to detail that few architects in history have had. And on Vega Street, you can see his design elements in, for example, the plinths on which sculptures or busts stand. The street also has a rhythm to it. He thought of architecture as Palladio did, the great neoclassical architect from the Veneto region, as being linked to music with rhythm and harmony of proportions. And so on this street, he tries to have a rhythm of trees and lampposts and monuments that becomes predictable as you walk the length of it. The street's named after a Slovenian mathematician named Juri Vega, and it's basically celebrating Slovenia's intellectual heritage. You can find the statue of Vega, you can find the statue of Jacobus Gallus, who is a Baroque composer of choral music, and see who else you can find. Also along this, you have the backside of some of the buildings related to Ljubljana's music school, which is famous throughout Europe. And we can walk the length of it to Star Park, or we can stop a little bit early and look at NUC, the National and University Library. So let's do that first. If you're on Vega Street, you're actually along the side of NUC, the National and University Library. So we'll walk along to the front of it. And you can see the building from the angle of the corner of Vega Street and the street, the name of which is escaping me because I can't see the sign. It is on the front of the building. And one of the things that's nice to do is look at the facade from this angle, and you can see that it's constructed of bay windows that jut out from the facade. They're not flat to the facade. And it's meant to look like waves on a choppy sea. And the idea is that the world outside of the library is wild, unpredictable, raw, but inside is all the sophistication and order and reason that human intellect has superimposed on the world around us, let's say. So you go out from the wilds and the windblown city and you enter this sort of temple to learning. As you walk in, you'll see that there is a very well-worn doorknob that is made out of bronze that has been smoothed and polished through the hands of many students and researchers. And this is meant to be Pegasus. It's the head of Pegasus, the mythological winged horse. And it's meant to symbolize creativity and intellectual pursuit. Riding on the back of this winged horse, you can soar metaphorically. Put your hand on the doorway and push inside and walk up the steps towards the library. Now, unless you are a library card holder, you're not supposed to go in the main reading room, which is a bit of a shame. If you can take a guided tour, that's always nice to do because it's a spectacular space. But if you ask nicely, they should let you just walk through the main atrium. And the atrium is covered in a dark stone. And I have walked up the stairs leading towards the light-filled reading room many times for many different videos and documentaries. It's almost a running joke that you can't make a video without me walking slowly up the stairs. But it's something that's worth doing because it's meant to, of course, convey you from street level up to the reading room, but it also, because it's Plečnik, has a symbolic value as well. And the idea is that you are surrounded by the darkness of ignorance, and you can see a reflection in this dark stone as you move upwards slowly from the tomb-like darkness of the stone and ignorance into the light of knowledge in the reading room, which is flooded with light and is multi-stories tall and is a really spectacular space. Not spectacular on the level of like St. Peter's Basilica, where you're wowed and awed by the colossal nature of it, but at a human level, it just is a space that feels really good to be in. And this is something that was important to me to learn in my early art history classes. When I was first learning, I remember the earliest architectural history class that I had when I was a student at Colby College in Maine, and I had a seminar in architecture with Professor David Simon at 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights, and we would order pizza delivered, and we would all be in our pajamas because that's what American students wear whenever they can get away with it. And we would put our feet up on the table in our pajamas and eat the pizza, and Professor Simon would show us slides of architecture, and he would always say, "Isn't this the greatest thing ever?" This was what he said about just about everything he showed us, and much of what he showed us was brutalist or weird, and I thought, no, this isn't the greatest thing ever, but he always wanted us to argue why we liked something or didn't like it. And one of the most important things he did was teach me that architecture is as much about what it feels like to be in a space as it is about what the space looks like. We tend to think of architecture as, what a building looks like from the outside, the facade. And that's part of it. But in the Renaissance, the architect of a building was usually not the same person as the architect of a facade. Facades were a different specialization. The fronts of churches, for example, if you go to Florence, a different architect designed the facade of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo of Florence, than Arnolfo di Cambio, who designed the building itself. Or in the church of San Lorenzo in Florence, Michelangelo designed the church, but the facade is still blank. Nobody got around to making a facade. So think of it instead in terms of what it feels like to be in a space. you've probably been in spaces where you thought, I feel good in here, and maybe you're not quite sure why. The neoclassical architect Palladio, working in the 18th century in the Veneto region, tried to design his palaces based on musical harmonics. And his concept was that the harmonies that we know sound good in music, if we can transfer those proportions to architectural spaces, we should feel harmonious when in them. And people who visit Palladio's buildings feel like you step inside and all of a sudden you feel really good and you're not quite sure why. So this is something that I associate with Plečnik's architecture and in Nuuk as well. That process of walking up the stairs and walking into the reading room, it just feels good. And maybe you aren't sure why from logic level, but it's just more of a vibe you get, an emotional thing. You can also look around the landing area above those dark stairs and see various designs that you'll start to recognize are totally Plečnik-like. So he has some slices of fluted columns. The fluted is the striations on the outside of a column. It's not smooth, but it's got those lines going on it that are used as benches. He's sticking columns everywhere. He's got columns that don't support anything just because he likes columns. He's got lighting fixtures that resemble columns. And he's got lots of beautiful stone. It's just a classical elegance that is handled in a way that you get the vibe that it's not classical. There's no way it feels classical, but it also doesn't feel like modernism either. It's pure Plečnik. If we go outside of Nuuk, you can turn to the right and look up at Ljubljana Castle on the hill. But instead, we are going to continue walking as if you're coming straight out of Nuuk and passing either on Vega Street or on the street that runs parallel to it, going to Zvezda Park or Star Park. This is probably the most central, most used park in the middle of Ljubljana. It's really a square, not a park proper. That's something that Plečnik also helped design, Tivoli Park, which is expansive with promenades and backs onto a wooded hill, so you can actually go hiking and do jogs in the forest from the center of Ljubljana. But this is a park as a city square with greenery that he redesigned in the 1930s. And as the name suggests, it's shaped like a star. There's a geometric symbolism to his choice of using a star. This is before stars were the symbol of socialist Yugoslavia, so that's not the reference he's after, but it's the classical harmonious positioning of the star shape and its relation to Catholic mysticism, which really interested Plečnik. Plečnik was an enthusiastic Catholic. He was very pious. He dedicated himself to architecture, but he did lots of church architecture. And when he did church architecture, he would often either charge the lowest possible rate or not charge anything at all. And sometimes he paid for things out of pocket because he just felt for the local congregation that he wanted to give them the best possible space he could. Even if they couldn't really afford anything, he would come up with solutions. For example, in the Church of St. Michael on the Moor in Bari, which is just outside the city center, he wanted to commission chandeliers to light up the church interior. This was going to be too expensive, so instead he upcycled coffee grinders and converted them into really elegant chandeliers. And it's an example of Plečnik being well ahead of his time in terms of upcycling found objects that were near or on the building site. So if he found old pieces of masonry or columns, oh, he loves columns. The columns would be like Christmas for him. If he found an old column, he would reuse it. Recycling, upcycling, and using as much local material as possible and working with local craftsmen. This seems logical today because it's the thing today. When Plečnik was working, that was quite unusual and revolutionary, and the sign of having lots of money and power was to buy expensive things from far away and show off that you could import them. And Plečnik had the opposite idea, doing what's local, the best of what's local whenever you can. What did he add to the Star Park? Well, Star Park has a central axis and the pathways radiating outward, bringing a symmetry and order to a park that was previously just a space of greenery within the center of the city. It connects the various other main squares, and it has a stone paved area that sometimes has pop-up concerts, especially in the wintertime. And Plečnik designed the stone benches and pathways lined with linden trees. Linden tree is the national tree of Slovenia, and in Slavic cultures, villages would have linden trees as a central meeting point, usually for village elders who were deciding on, what the village would need to do, effectively like board meetings for villagers. They would traditionally meet under linden trees. And so linden trees has this aspect of an important association with Slavic culture, and it's the national tree of Slovenia. If we continue on, we can go to Prešeren Square, named after Slovenia's most famous poet, France Prešeren, a 19th century romantic poet. And this was renovated by Plečnik, and he added what's called the triple bridge to it between 1929 and 1932. So Plečnik added 2 pedestrian bridges to flank the main bridge across the Ljubljanica River, and he set them at angles to each other so they weren't all lined up. They were inspired in terms of design by the Rialto Bridge in Venice, and he gave a purpose to each of the 3 bridges. It wasn't random that there were 3. One was for pedestrians, one was for cyclists, and one was for automobiles. He also installed underneath the bridges some of the oldest continuously active public restrooms in Europe, which sounds really weird, but fun facts and superlatives. And I'm told that they are in fine order, and as public restrooms go, they are really quite clean and lovely. So if the call of the wild summons you, this is a good place to go answer that call because it has a historical resonance to it. In this square, there is a pink facaded church that was really the centerpiece, but a statue of France Prešeren that's not the work of Plečnik stands as the central point. And Prešeren was important as a poet because he helped rally Slovenian nationalism through his poetry, which was written and published in Slovenian. And that might not sound so revolutionary, but as we mentioned at the Napoleon monument, the language was the main point of unity and continuity that made Slovenians feel like they were Slovenian. And Prešeren's poetry, his Zdravljica, a toast, became the lyrics to the national anthem of independent Slovenia, for example. And during the Spring of Nations, which is in the mid-19th century, when the nationalities that were part of large-scale European empires started to think, we would like to be independent. This happened through most of Europe. Slovenia was part of it, and that independence was asserted in a non-violent way in Slovenia through writing, publishing, teaching children in Slovenian, the local language. Now, the statue of Prešeren, there's an allegorical personification of poetry, placing a laurel crown, the crown of poets, on Prešeren's head. And Prešeren is looking across at some distant object on the far side of the square. And if you follow his eye line, you can see a terracotta relief sculpture of Julia Primc. Julia Primc was the woman who Prešeren always loved, but she was totally uninterested in him. And so his object of devotion and admiration from a distance, and he wrote many of his poems inspired by her. And so he's shown in posterity in this magnificent bronze sculpture looking out across at her. This is an example of really lovely urban design on Plečnik's part. There's a nice flow, the idea that you have dedicated bridges for different types of transportation, so you don't have people walking across the car bridge, although that happens today, of course. It shows how thoughtful he was and thinking ahead in a way that is still practical for people today. It feels good to be in this space. It's a nice centerpiece for the city. Plečnik also had some kooky ideas that were probably more theoretical than actual. He didn't actually intend to do them, but I'll mention a few. One of his theoretical ideas that he just played around with was to take the Ljubljanica River that flows through Ljubljana and to pave all of it so that he would effectively make a bridge that doesn't go across it, but goes along the length of it. And he imagined it as the biggest ballroom in Europe, and it would flow the entire length of the river, and the river would be underneath, covered by this terrace of paved stones that would run snaking through the center of the city. Now, in practice, would this have worked? Probably not, but it's an interesting idea that he played around with. He also played around with an idea, if you look up at Ljubljana Castle Hill. The Ljubljana Castle is, of course, a medieval fortress He renovated some outdoor elements of it, but he had another theoretical idea that he probably didn't actually mean to do in practice, but he was playing around with, where he suggested that they knock down Ljubljana Castle, looking ahead to modernity, and that they build a parliament building on the castle hill, but at an angle. And his original design for the parliament building is very distinctive. It looks like an upside-down ice cream cone. And it would have been the architectural icon that the city of Ljubljana doesn't have. And it would have been funny because it would have been sticking out at an angle, not at the top of the castle hill, intentionally feeling like, is it going to fall over? It would be an engineering feat to make it so it was statically functional. And he had this idea that there would be 12 monumental columns at angles supporting this cone at the top of the dome at the center point of the parliament. And when Slovenia's money was printed called dinar, which was from Slovenia's independence until I think it was 2004 when they joined the Eurozone, you could see this design on some of their banknotes. And it's a cool idea theoretically. Would it have worked in practice? Probably not. As a historian, I'm glad they didn't knock down Ljubljana Castle, but it's a kind of an interesting idea. There was another bridge that we didn't cross, but if you're up for it, you can go back a little ways, called the Cobbler's Bridge, or Šustarski most, which Plečnik designed from 1931 to 1932. That's the bridge that you would cross if you wanted to cross the river after you emerge from Nuk. So it's a little bit back along the Ljubljanica. And this is totally Plečnik central. It's a bridge that has columns lining both sides, but the columns don't support anything. Normally columns are there because they're allowing for holes penetrated into a wall for windows or a loggia or doors, and they're supporting a story above. Otherwise, there's no purpose to them, but Plečnik just loved his columns. I'm sure Freud has something to say about that, but he's got these firm columns shooting up into the sky wherever he can, and on this Cobbler's Bridge, he has them lining both sides of the bridge, but they have no purpose other than decorative and giving this symbolic vibe of classicalness to Ljubljana. The Cobbler's Bridge is so named because there were shoemakers who used to sell their goods there. Further back along the Ljubljanica River, not part of the tour today, there are various aspects of embankments of the Ljubljanica River that Plečnik designed. He also designed embankments to a tributary, and you can visit Plečnik's own house, which is an award-winning museum, which I certainly recommend you do. But we may save that for a special episode of the Ljubljana podcast, where we walk through that together. To finish our tour, let's cross the triple bridge and go towards Tržnice, which is the central market. Now, this is going to sound a little bit Da Vinci Code-ish, but Plečnik somehow managed to get commissions for all of the public buildings and spaces that would have been in an ancient Greek polis or city. So he got commissions to design the amphitheater and the stadium and an acropolis or temple, in this case a church, a necropolis, a city of the dead, or a cemetery, which is not in walking distance, but is one of the great things you can visit by a short bus ride or car ride out of the city center. And he could never have expected this, but he was in the right place at the right time. He was by far the most capable architect, and he had good connections, particularly Francesc Stele, who was the leading art and architectural historian and critic at the time, who was sort of his intellectual champion, writing in praise of his work. They were also good friends. And he also was championed by Matko Prilošek, who was basically in charge of city works. And a very dynamic mayor named Ivan Hribar was also a fan of Plečnik. So the big decision makers were in his corner. And so he had the chance, though he could never have planned this as sort of a master plan, of doing all of these commissions that effectively gave him the chance to put his imprint on his birth city and to develop it into something that has echoes of a modernist classical city, elevating Ljubljana, and this is a very modernist thing for him to have done, elevating Ljubljana from what he had called, and I quote, a cultural backwater when he has been growing up there, into the capital, or rather at this point, a future capital and a city of importance and of culture. He also managed to get a lot of commissions that are all on a straight line. If you draw a line on a city map from Plečnik's house to the stadium, it's quite amazing how many Plečnik's designs fall directly on that straight line as the crow flies. Again, this is not something he could have ever planned. It's just the luck of the draw, but it gives you the sense that, Dan Brown could write a conspiracy theory about it. So we're crossing to Tržnice, and the market square is very well designed and with practicality in mind. So these modernist architects, so much of what they do is future-proofing their designs and thinking ahead. I was lucky as a student. I was a summer intern at the Yale British Art Center in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a building designed by the architect Louis Kahn. And it was in the 90s when I was there. It was designed, I think, in the 60s, 70s. And it was perfectly adapted to the modern computer era, even though it had been designed long before that. It was just so cleverly put together, and it was effectively future-proofed, and it looked fresh and modern, and it was useful, which isn't always the case with architecture. Sometimes we have the sense that it's of a certain moment, but it's going to be no longer useful, no longer feel fresh a few decades on. So Plečnik was very good at that, future-proofing it, and he designed Tržnice with maximum hygiene and utility in mind. So he put the fishmongers along the bottom level closest to the Ljubljanica River, so they could dump their leftover fish parts directly into the river. I don't know how hygienic that sounds, but back in the day, that was as good as it got. He put the meat vendors, the butchers, in a separate building, so no cross-contamination. And he had a large open central square for fruit and vegetable vendors. And then he had a closed covered market where you have things like cheesemongers and people selling dried fruit and nuts and baked goods. And it's really fun to explore. Tržnice is a great place to go. The real foodies and the chefs will get there very early, between 6 and 7 in the morning. It's open until around 1 p.m. each day, but the earlier you go, the better. And there's some fun stuff to spot here unrelated to Plečnik, but I'll mention it anyway. So if you see a very long line in front of one sauerkraut vendor and not the others, that sauerkraut vendor is Marietka, whose family is the last one to have indigenous seeds for what's called Ljubljana cabbage, which is said to make the best sauerkraut around. And it's really good. You can try it raw. I highly recommend you get some sauerkraut from her. Tell her that Noah sent you. You can even buy sauerkraut juice, which sounds like a joke, but it's actually tastes good and promotes regularity, if that's something that sounds good to you. And also try sour turnip, kisla repa. This sounds very strange to me, but it's totally delicious. There are also vending machines for beautifully colored, jewel-like candles. Now, when I first saw these, I thought they were decorative. Turns out they're grave candles, and there's a tradition of lighting a candle and leaving it on the grave of a loved one. I thought they just looked really nice, so when I first moved here, I bought a bunch of them and would light them to decorate my apartment. And when my future wife came over for the first time, she probably either thought I was an idiot or a serial killer, and it turned out I was just an idiot, so that was okay. She stuck around. But it's kind of fun to see this vending machine. Also, if you come from a country like the US where pasteurization is legally obligatory and you can actually go to jail for selling unpasteurized milk and cheese and butter, it's fascinating for people to see that there is an abundance of delicious unpasteurized goods. And they're actually automats. Some of them are called mlekomats, which is like a milkomat. And there's one in the square where you get fresh, unpasteurized dairy products. And each one of these automats, so you can find ones related to honey or eggs or meat or milk, all sorts of things, is run by a specific farm. And the farm is in charge of keeping it fresh, restocking it. And you can get fresh, unpasteurized milk anytime you want. The kind of thing that would send you to jail in the US, you can get here, no problem. So it's great to wander the market, to try different produce, to go in different seasons. There's, of course, a lot more to Plečnik's Ljubljana. We're going to stop here for today, but we'll include more architectural tours and also a special tour of Plečnik's house at some future date. So I hope you have a great day today and enjoy the rest of your time in Ljubljana. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Ljubljana Podcast. The Ljubljana Podcast is brought to you by Hotel Mrak, the best boutique art hotel in the center of Ljubljana. This podcast is produced by Urška Charney and hosted by Noah Charney. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.